Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of unlikely redemption where the dark alleys of a criminal past give way to the transformative power of unexpected love and second chances. Enjoy the story. Jack the Hammer Harrison leaned against his sleek black Cadillac Escalade, his weathered face creased with a mixture of amusement and nostalgia. His right-hand man, Steve the Bull Mathers, stood beside him, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Boss, are you sure about this? It's not like the old days. We can't just rough people up anymore," Steve said, his voice low and gravelly. Jack chuckled, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "Relax, Steve. I'm not here to crack skulls. Just want to see how the new generation handles things." They were parked at the edge of Oakwood Cemetery, waiting for Jack's crew to finish a job. Gone were the days of violent shakedowns and bloody turf wars. Now Jack ran a security consulting firm called Eagle Eye Protection. It was all very official, very legal. On paper, at least. "You know, Steve," Jack mused, his eyes distant, "sometimes I miss the old days. The adrenaline rush, the thrill of the chase. Now it's all paperwork and polite threats." Steve nodded sagely. "Times change, boss. At least we're not looking over our shoulders for the feds anymore." Jack grunted in agreement, then pushed off the car. "I'm gonna take a walk. You boys can handle this, right?" "Sure thing, boss. We'll give this guy a scare he won't forget." As Jack strolled through the cemetery, his mind wandered to the past. He'd come a long way from the scrappy kid in the foster system. Back then, survival meant having the fastest fists and the sharpest wits. Now, at 45, he was a respected and feared businessman. His feet carried him to a familiar spot, his mother's grave. The headstone was lavish, a far cry from the pauper's burial she would have had if Jack hadn't made it big. He stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the name etched in granite, Evelyn Harrison. Jack's childhood flashed before his eyes, the endless parade of uncles, the stench of cheap booze, the sound of breaking glass. His mother, beautiful but broken, promising to quit drinking tomorrow. The day child services finally took him away, kicking and screaming, because he didn't want to leave his mom alone. He shook his head, trying to clear the memories. That was all in the past now. He'd made something of himself, even if it wasn't exactly by the book. Suddenly, a sound broke through his reverie. A whimper? A cry? Jack's hand instinctively went to the gun hidden under his jacket. Old habits die hard. Jack followed the sound, his footsteps silent on the damp grass. It seemed to be coming from a freshly dug grave. His mind raced. Had someone been buried alive? Was this some sick joke? As he approached the edge of the hole, he peered in, ready for anything. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Huddled at the bottom of the grave was a small boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old. The kid was filthy, shivering, and looked scared out of his mind. "Hey, kid," Jack called out, his gruff voice softening slightly. "You okay down there?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear. Jack could see tear tracks cutting through the dirt on his face. "It's all right," Jack said, kneeling at the edge of the grave. "I'm going to get you out of there. Can you reach my hand?" The boy hesitated for a moment, then stretched up. Jack leaned in, grasping the small, cold hand in his own. With one strong pull, he lifted the child out of the hole. Once on solid ground, the boy started shivering even more violently. Without thinking, Jack shrugged off his expensive leather jacket and wrapped it around the kid's shoulders. "What's your name, buddy?" Jack asked, his tone gentler than it had been in years. "Tommy," the boy stuttered, his teeth chattering. "All right, Tommy. Let's get you warmed up, and then you can tell me how you ended up playing hide-and-seek in a graveyard, okay?" Tommy nodded, clutching the oversized jacket around him like a shield. Jack led the boy back to his car, where Steve and the others were waiting. Their eyes widened at the sight of their boss with a dirty, bedraggled child. "Boss?" Steve questioned, his eyebrows raised. "Change of plans, boys," Jack announced. "We're making a pit stop." In the warmth of Jack's car, with a thermos of hot chocolate, Jack always kept some handy, a habit from his own rough childhood, Tommy's shivers finally subsided. Jack turned in his seat to face the boy. "All right, kid. Spill. What were you doing in that hole?" Tommy's lower lip trembled. I came to visit my mom. It's her birthday today. I brought her flowers. Jack's heart clenched. He remembered the small bouquet he'd seen at the bottom of the grave. And who let you come to a cemetery alone? Jack pressed, his voice gruff but not unkind. Nobody, Tommy admitted. I ran away from the group home. They wouldn't let me come, so I snuck out. Group home? Jack echoed, a sinking feeling in his gut. You're in foster care? Tommy nodded miserably. Please don't take me back there. The older kids are mean, and some of the adults, they hit us sometimes. Jack's jaw clenched. He knew all too well what that was like. Don't worry, kid. You're not going back there tonight. He turned to Steve. Take us home and call Razor. Tell him to dig up everything he can on Tommy's group home. I want to know what's going on there. As they drove through the city, Jack's mind was racing. What was he doing? He couldn't just kidnap a kid, even if it was to help him. But he also couldn't bear the thought of sending Tommy back to a place where he was being mistreated. When they arrived at Jack's penthouse apartment, Tommy's eyes widened in awe. Wow, he breathed. Is this where you live? Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. For now, it's where you're going to live too. At least until we figure things out. He showed Tommy to the guest room, helped him get cleaned up, and found some old clothes that sort of fit the boy. As Tommy devoured a late-night meal of reheated lasagna, Jack made some calls. By morning, he had a clearer picture of the situation. And it wasn't pretty. The group home Tommy had run from had a history of complaints, but nothing had ever stuck. The system was overloaded, underfunded, and turning a blind eye to the abuse happening right under its nose. Jack's blood boiled. He'd thought he'd left that world behind, but here it was, still churning out broken kids like a factory. As dawn broke over the city, Jack made a decision that would change his life forever. Over the next few days, Jack's penthouse became a hive of activity. Lawyers came and went, documents were signed, and strings were pulled. Jack Harrison, former street thug turned semi-legitimate businessman, was about to become a foster parent. Tommy, oblivious to the whirlwind of activity around him, seemed to blossom in Jack's care. The scared, shivering boy from the cemetery was replaced by a curious, energetic child who followed Jack around like a shadow. Hey, Mr. Jack, Tommy asked one afternoon, as Jack pored over some paperwork. Are you really going to let me stay with you? Jack looked up, meeting the boy's hopeful gaze. That's the plan, kid. If you want to, that is. Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? You mean it? I mean it, Jack confirmed, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. But there's gonna be some rules, got it? No more running away no matter what. Tommy nodded solemnly. I promise. Cross my heart and hope to die. Jack winced at the phrase. Let's not talk about dying, okay? How about we seal it with a handshake instead? As they shook hands, Jack marveled at how small Tommy's hand was in his own. He'd spent years building a reputation as a tough guy, someone you didn't want to cross. But this little boy had managed to crack his hard exterior in a matter of days. Later that night, after Tommy had gone to bed, Jack sat on his balcony, nursing a glass of whiskey. Steve joined him, leaning against the railing. You sure about this, boss? Steve asked, his voice low. Taking in a kid? It's a big responsibility. Jack sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I'm not sure of anything anymore, Steve, but I know I can't send him back to that hellhole, and maybe this is my chance to do something good for once. Steve nodded thoughtfully. You know, the boys and I were talking. If you're going to do this, we want to help. None of us had it easy growing up. Maybe we can make sure this kid doesn't have to go through what we did. Jack looked at his old friend, surprised. You guys would do that? In a heartbeat, boss, Steve affirmed. We may be a bunch of old thugs, but we take care of our own, and if this kid's important to you, then he's important to us. For the first time in years, Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He cleared it gruffly, blinking back the moisture in his eyes. Thanks, Steve. That means a lot. As Steve left, Jack stayed on the balcony, looking out over the city. He thought about his own childhood, about all the times he'd wished for someone to rescue him. Now, he had the chance to be that someone for Tommy. It wouldn't be easy. Jack knew he had a lot to learn about being a parent, but as he thought about Tommy's smile, about the trust in the boy's eyes, he knew it would be worth it. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd start making some changes. It was time to clean up his act for good. No more shady deals, no more skirting the law. From now on, Eagle Eye Protection would be 100% legitimate. As he headed to bed, Jack paused by Tommy's room. The door was ajar, and he could see the boy sleeping peacefully, clutching a stuffed bear Jack had bought him. "Sleep tight, kid," Jack whispered. "Things are going to be different from now on, I promise." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack the Hammer Harrison went to bed with a clear conscience and a heart full of hope. The next few months were a whirlwind of changes for both Jack and Tommy. Jack threw himself into his new role as a foster parent with the same intensity he'd once applied to his less-than-legal activities. There were challenges, of course. Tommy had nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. Jack would rush to his room, holding the trembling boy until he calmed down. "It's okay, buddy," Jack would murmur, his gruff voice softened by concern. "You're safe now. I've got you." Tommy also struggled in school, years of neglect having left gaps in his education. Jack hired tutors and spent hours helping Tommy with his homework, often learning alongside him. "I never finished school myself," Jack admitted one night as they puzzled over a math problem. "But we're going to make sure you do, kid. You're going to have all the opportunities I never had." Jack's business associates were bemused by the change in their boss. The feared Hammer was now more likely to be found at a parent-teacher conference than a back-alley deal. One day, Steve walked into Jack's office to find him on the phone, his voice raised in anger. "I don't care what your policy is," Jack was saying. "My kid needs his inhaler. You're going to make sure he has it at school, or I'm going to come down there and—" Steve cleared his throat, and Jack looked up, seeming to remember where he was. He lowered his voice. "Just make it happen, okay? Thanks." As he hung up, Steve grinned. "School giving Tommy trouble?" Jack ran a hand over his face. "Who knew being a parent was harder than running a criminal empire?" Steve laughed. "You're doing great, boss. The kid's lucky to have you." Jack's expression softened. "Nah, I'm the lucky one. Tommy, he's given me a reason to be better, you know." As the months passed, Jack and Tommy settled into a routine. They had breakfast together every morning. Jack religiously attended every school event, and they spent weekends exploring the city or just hanging out at home. Tommy started to come out of his shell, revealing a quick wit and a kind heart. He made friends at his new school and even joined the junior basketball team. As Jack and Tommy's bond grew stronger, Jack found himself increasingly determined to leave his old life behind for good. He began the painstaking process of transforming Eagle Eye Protection into a legitimate security firm, cutting ties with shady clients and turning down lucrative but questionable contracts. Not everyone was happy with this new direction. One evening, as Jack was leaving the office, he was confronted by an old associate, Mickey the Shark Sullivan. "What's the deal, Harrison?" Mickey snarled, blocking Jack's path. "You going soft on us?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "Back off, Mickey. I'm just changing the way I do business. You should try it sometime." Mickey sneered. "It's that kid, isn't it? He's made you weak. The old Jack would never have turned down a job like the one I offered last week." Jack felt his temper rising, but fought to keep it in check. "The old Jack is gone, Mickey. I suggest you get used to it." As he pushed past Mickey, the man called after him. "You can't change who you are, Harrison. Once a thug, always a thug." Jack's fists clenched, but he kept walking. He had promised Tommy he'd be home in time for dinner, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Later that night, after Tommy had gone to bed, Jack sat in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey. Mickey's words echoed in his mind. Was he right? Could Jack really change? Or was he just kidding himself? A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Mr. Jack?" Tommy's voice called out timidly. "Are you okay?" Jack quickly set aside his drink. "Come in, buddy. What are you doing up?" Tommy padded into the room, clutching his stuffed bear. "I had a bad dream. Can I sit with you for a bit?" "Of course," Jack said, patting the seat next to him. As Tommy curled up beside him, Jack felt his doubts begin to melt away. This, right here, was what mattered now. "Want to talk about your dream?" Jack asked gently. Tommy shook his head. Can you tell me a story instead? About when you were little? Jack hesitated. His childhood wasn't exactly filled with happy bedtime stories, but looking at Tommy's expectant face, he decided to share a rare good memory. Well, he began, when I was about your age, there was this one summer day when my mom was feeling good. She took me to Coney Island. As he recounted the story of carousel rides and cotton candy, Jack realized that even in the darkest times, there had been moments of light. And now, with Tommy, he had the chance to create a whole lifetime of good memories. Just as Jack was starting to feel confident in his new role as a foster parent, a curveball came his way. The social worker assigned to Tommy's case, Miss Jenkins, scheduled an unexpected home visit. It's standard procedure, she explained over the phone. We need to ensure that Tommy is in a stable and nurturing environment. Jack spent the days leading up to the visit in a frenzy of cleaning and preparation. He even enlisted Steve and the boys to help childproof the penthouse. Boss, I think you're overthinking this, Steve said as he watched Jack rearrange the living room furniture for the third time. The place looks great. Tommy's happy. What more could they want? Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, Steve. What if they dig into my background? What if they decide I'm not fit to be a foster parent? Steve placed a reassuring hand on Jack's shoulder. They'd be crazy to take Tommy away from you. Anyone can see how much that kid loves you. When the day of the visit arrived, Jack was a bundle of nerves. He'd faced down rival gangs and corrupt cops without breaking a sweat. But the thought of this social worker potentially taking Tommy away terrified him. Miss Jenkins turned out to be a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She toured the apartment, asked Jack a series of probing questions, and then sat down to talk with Tommy alone. As Jack waited in the kitchen, he could hear Tommy's animated voice, punctuated by occasional laughter. Finally, after what felt like hours, Miss Jenkins emerged. Well, Mr. Harrison, she began, her face unreadable, I must say, when I first heard about your unconventional background, I had my doubts. Jack's heart sank. This was it. They were going to take Tommy away. But then, Miss Jenkins smiled. However, it's clear to me that you've provided Tommy with a loving, stable home. His progress over the past few months has been remarkable. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. So, does this mean... Miss Jenkins nodded. I'll be recommending that Tommy remain in your care. And if things continue to go well, we can start discussing permanent adoption in a few months. As the social worker left, Tommy came bounding into the kitchen. Did you hear that, Mr. Jack? I get to stay. Jack scooped Tommy up in a bear hug, his eyes suspiciously moist. You bet, kiddo. You're stuck with me now. That night, as Jack tucked Tommy into bed, the boy looked up at him seriously. Mr. Jack, can I ask you something? Anything, buddy. When Miss Jenkins asked if I felt safe here, I told her I've never felt safer in my whole life. That's true, you know. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. I'm glad, Tommy. I promise I'll always do my best to keep you safe. Tommy nodded, then asked hesitantly, Do you think maybe someday I could call you Dad? Jack's heart swelled. I'd like that very much, Tommy. Whenever you're ready. As he turned out the light and closed Tommy's door, Jack felt a sense of peace wash over him. He'd spent so much of his life fighting, for survival, for power, for respect. But now, for the first time, he was fighting for something truly worthwhile, a family. The months flew by, and before Jack knew it, it was time to start the formal adoption process. He threw himself into it with the same determination he'd once applied to building his empire. There were mountains of paperwork, interviews with psychologists, and more home visits. Jack's past came under scrutiny, and he found himself having to explain and justify choices he'd made years ago. One particularly grueling day, after a tough interview with the adoption agency, Jack returned home feeling defeated. He found Tommy waiting for him, a handmade card clutched in his hands. I made this for you, Tommy said shyly, handing over the card. On the front in wobbly letters, it read, World's Best Dad. Inside, Tommy had drawn a picture of the two of them, stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. Jack felt his eyes well up. "This is beautiful, buddy. Thank you." Tommy hugged him tightly. "Don't worry, Dad, it's gonna work out. We belong together." In that moment, Jack knew he'd move heaven and earth to make this adoption happen. Tommy was his son, in every way that mattered, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The final adoption hearing arrived on a crisp autumn day. Jack wore his best suit, and Tommy insisted on wearing a tie to match. As they stood before the judge, hand in hand, Jack felt a mix of terror and hope. The judge reviewed their file, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Harrison," she began, "your background is unusual for an adoptive parent." Jack's heart sank, but he stood tall. "Your Honor, I know my past isn't perfect, but Tommy has changed my life. He's made me want to be a better man, a better father. I love him more than I ever thought possible, and I promise to spend the rest of my life giving him the family and the future he deserves." The judge's stern expression softened. She looked at Tommy. "And how do you feel about this, young man?" Tommy squeezed Jack's hand. "He's my dad," he said simply. "He makes me feel safe and loved. Please don't take him away from me." There was a moment of tense silence, and then the judge smiled. "Well, in that case, it gives me great pleasure to approve this adoption. Congratulations to you both." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Steve and the boys, who had come to show their support, whooped and hollered. Jack swept Tommy up in a huge hug, tears streaming down both their faces. "We did it, buddy," Jack whispered. "You're officially a Harrison now." Tommy beamed up at him. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, son, more than you'll ever know." 5 years later. Jack stood in the backyard of his new suburban home, watching as Tommy, now a lanky teenager, shot hoops with his friends. The sounds of laughter and trash talk filled the air. Steve appeared at his side, handing him a cold beer. "Quite a change from the old days, eh, boss?" Jack chuckled. "You can say that again, but I wouldn't have it any other way." Eagle Eye Protection was now a thriving, completely legitimate business. Jack had used his connections and street smarts to build it into one of the most respected security firms in the city. But more importantly, he'd built a real life, a life he could be proud of. As the sun began to set, Jack called out, "All right, boys, who's ready for some burgers?" The kids cheered and raced towards the grill. Tommy lagged behind, falling into step beside Jack. "Hey, Dad," he said. "I've been thinking about what I want to do after high school." "Oh yeah?" Jack replied, slinging an arm around his son's shoulders. "What's on your mind?" Tommy took a deep breath. I think I want to be a social worker. Help kids like me, you know." Jack felt a surge of pride. "I think that's a great idea, son. You'd be amazing at that." As they joined the others around the grill, Jack marveled at how far they'd come. From a chance encounter in a cemetery to this, a family, a home, a future full of promise. Jack the Hammer Harrison, once feared enforcer and crime boss, was now just Jack, loving father, respected businessman, and the luckiest man alive, and he wouldn't have it any other way.